It was the fuel that could have saved them all. 50,000 gallons of precious gasoline, enough to power a panzer division for weeks. Yet Colonel Friedrich Reimann stood paralyzed before the underground storage facility, the weight of his terrible revelation crushing any sense of triumph. The date was January 17, 1945. The Soviet Red Army had just broken through German lines at the Vistula River, and the easternmost territories of the Reich lay exposed. In that frigid Polish forest, surrounded by exhausted soldiers who believed they had found salvation in liquid form, Reimann realized with horrifying clarity what Hitler's high command refused to acknowledge. Germany was already defeated. The war was lost. And this massive fuel cache, a prize that would have been celebrated just months earlier, now represented nothing but the futility of continued resistance and the senseless waste of young German lives. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The discovery of the fuel depot occurred during what military historians now call the desperate phase of the German retreat from Poland. The Eastern Front was collapsing at an alarming rate. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces had launched their massive Vistula-Oder offensive just 3 days earlier, on January 14th, overwhelming German defensive positions with over 2 million soldiers, 4,000 tanks, and 10,000 aircraft. The sheer momentum of the Soviet advance, covering 40 kilometers per day at its peak, had caught the German High Command completely off guard, despite intelligence warnings that had been systematically ignored. Colonel Friedrich Reimann commanded what remained of the 25th Panzer Regiment, a once proud unit reduced to approximately 600 men and a handful of operational tanks. At 43 years old, Reimann was a veteran of both the Polish campaign of 1939 and the invasion of France in 1940. His service record noted multiple decorations, including the Iron Cross First Class, earned during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. A career officer from a military family in Saxony, Reimann was described by those who served under him as meticulous, professionally detached, and utterly dedicated to his men. Unlike many of his contemporaries in the Wehrmacht's officer corps, he had maintained a notable distance from Nazi party politics, focusing instead on the tactical requirements of his command. The winter of 1944-45 had been particularly brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping to 20 degrees below zero. German supply lines were stretched beyond their breaking point. Fuel shortages had become so severe that Reimann's remaining tanks were often immobilized, making them easy targets for Soviet artillery and air attacks. His men had taken to burning furniture and floorboards from abandoned Polish houses to keep from freezing at night. Food rations had been cut by half, then by half again. The once vaunted German military machine was running on empty, literally and figuratively. The discovery occurred almost by accident. One of Reimann's reconnaissance patrols, led by Lieutenant Klaus Hermann, had been tasked with finding an alternate route westward that would avoid the main Soviet advance. Hermann's small team of 5 men had ventured into dense forest approximately 15 kilometers northwest of Łódź, searching for paths that could accommodate vehicles. What they found instead, hidden beneath camouflage netting and a layer of fresh snow, were the telltale ventilation pipes of an underground storage facility. "We thought at first it might be a partisan bunker," Lieutenant Hermann later wrote in his field report, but the construction was too sophisticated, too professional. This was military-grade engineering. When we cleared the snow from the main entrance hatch and saw the Wehrmacht Supply Corps markings, we knew we had stumbled onto something significant. Significant indeed. The facility had been constructed in mid-1944 as part of a forward supply network intended to support a planned counteroffensive that never materialized. As Soviet forces pushed the front lines westward, the depot's existence had apparently been lost in the administrative chaos of retreat. What Hermann's patrol discovered was a fully stocked underground fuel depot containing approximately 50,000 gallons of refined gasoline meticulously stored in hundreds of steel drums, along with engine oil, lubricants, and even a small cache of spare parts. For a mechanized unit that had been scraping by on fumes, it seemed like salvation. Lieutenant Herman immediately dispatched a runner back to Ryman's position, maintaining radio silence to avoid Soviet interception. The news reached Ryman near midnight on January 16th as he huddled with his staff officers in the cellar of an abandoned farm. Witnesses would later recall how the colonel's expression changed upon receiving the report, not to joy or relief, but to a strange, distant look that none could quite interpret. "Verify and secure the position," he ordered. "I will arrive with a security detachment at 5500 hours. No one is to access the supplies until I have personally assessed the situation." Dawn on January 17th broke cold and clear, with the distant rumble of artillery providing a constant reminder of the Soviet advance. Ryman, accompanied by 20 of his most trusted men, reached the forest depot just as the first rays of sun filtered through the pine branches. Lieutenant Herman greeted his commander with a proper salute, despite the informal nature military protocols had taken in those desperate days. "It's all still here, Herr Oberst," Herman reported, "untouched. Enough fuel to get every remaining vehicle in the regiment back to German territory." Ryman nodded silently and ordered the main entrance hatch opened. The heavy steel door swung upward, revealing a concrete staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up carried the unmistakable smell of petroleum products, a scent that would once have represented power and mobility to any tanker, but which now carried a more complex significance. The colonel descended alone, ordering his men to remain outside. The underground chamber was vast, approximately 30 meters long by 15 meters wide, with a ceiling supported by reinforced concrete pillars. The temperature inside was notably warmer than the frozen landscape above. Row upon row of fuel drums stood in perfect military alignment, each bearing the eagle and swastika emblem of the Wehrmacht. Smaller containers of specialized lubricants and hydraulic fluids lined the walls. A separate alcove contained neatly organized spare parts, filters, belts, hoses, and more specialized components for German armor. It was, by any measure, a treasure trove for a retreating army desperate for resources. Yet, as Ryman surveyed the bounty by flashlight, his mind was processing military realities that extended far beyond this momentary discovery. The colonel spent nearly 30 minutes alone in the underground facility, conducting a meticulous inventory. When he finally emerged into the winter sunlight, his face had taken on an ashen quality that concerned even his most battle-hardened men. He called his officers together, Lieutenant Herman, Captain Weber, and Lieutenants Schrader and Dietrich, and led them a short distance from the main group. What transpired in that small clearing would later be recounted by all 4 officers in separate testimonies after the war, with remarkable consistency, despite the passage of time and the differing circumstances of their post-war lives. "Gentlemen," Ryman began, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, "what we have discovered here represents enough fuel to move our remaining vehicles approximately 400 kilometers westward. Under normal circumstances, this would be cause for celebration." He paused, scanning the faces of the younger officers. "But these are not normal circumstances. I must now share with you my assessment of our strategic situation, based not on propaganda from Berlin, but on military reality." What followed was an astonishingly frank analysis of Germany's position in January 1945. Ryman laid out the catastrophic losses on both eastern and western fronts. He detailed the collapse of the Ardennes offensive in the west, the overwhelming Soviet numerical superiority in the east, the critical shortage of manpower throughout the German armed forces, and the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity by Allied bombing. "The Reich has lost this war," he stated flatly. "Not might lose, has lost. What remains now is merely the final accounting of that loss in human lives. Berlin may not acknowledge this reality for weeks or even months, But, as officers responsible for the lives of German soldiers, we must acknowledge it today, here, now. The officers stood in stunned silence. While doubts about Germany's ultimate victory had certainly grown as the situation deteriorated, to hear such a definitive assessment from a respected senior officer, and one not known for defeatism, was shocking. Captain Weber, the most politically orthodox of the group, finally spoke. Herr Oberst, such talk borders on— "On what, Weber?" Reimann interrupted sharply. "On reality? On the professional military assessment I am obligated to make as your commanding officer? Look around you. The division that once numbered 12,000 men now fields barely 600. The Luftwaffe that once darkened the skies is nowhere to be seen. Soviet forces outnumber us 10-1 in men, 20-1 in armor. These are not opinions, they are facts," the colonel continued, his voice lowering. "Now we face a critical decision regarding this fuel. The obvious choice, the expected choice, would be to use it to facilitate our regiment's withdrawal westward. This would potentially save the lives of our remaining men in the short term." Lieutenant Schrader nodded eagerly. "Precisely, Herr Oberst. We could be across the Oder within days." "And then what?" Reimann asked quietly. "We reach German soil, are reinforced with old men and boys from the Volkssturm, and continue a hopeless resistance that only prolongs the inevitable. Every week this war continues. Thousands more German civilians die in Allied bombing raids. Our cities are reduced further to rubble. And for what final outcome?" The implications of Raymond's thinking began to dawn on his officers. Lieutenant Dietrich, the youngest at barely 23 years old, paled visibly. "Sir, are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing, Dietrich. I am asking you as officers to consider our responsibility in this moment, not just to the 600 men under our immediate command, but to the German people as a whole." The discovery of the fuel depot had placed Colonel Reimann at a moral crossroads that exemplified the impossible situations faced by conscientious German officers in the war's final months. The strategic assessment was clear. Germany had lost the war. Every day the conflict continued meant more German deaths, more destruction of what remained of the country, with no possibility of changing the final outcome. Yet the professional and cultural ethos of the German officer corps demanded loyalty, obedience, and perseverance until the bitter end. Surrender was anathema, sabotage was treason, and the Nazi regime had made abundantly clear that defeatism of any kind would be punished not only against the individual officer, but potentially against his family as well. For Reimann, the massive fuel cache represented this dilemma in physical form. The gasoline could power his regiment's retreat, potentially saving his men in the short term, but ultimately contributing to a prolonged and futile resistance. Or he could prevent the fuel from being used, potentially hastening the war's end by some small measure, but at what personal cost? As the 5 officers stood in the forest clearing, the sounds of war provided a constant backdrop to their discussion. The artillery rumble had grown closer. Occasionally, the distinctive sound of Soviet Ilyushin ground attack aircraft could be heard in the distance. "Time is short," Reimann finally said. "We must make a decision about the fuel and about our next actions. I will hear your thoughts, but the final responsibility will be mine alone." What followed was an intense debate among the officers, each bringing their own perspective to the impossible situation. Captain Weber, still committed to the regime, argued forcefully for using the fuel to continue the fight. "The Führer will unleash new weapons soon," he insisted, repeating the propaganda that had become common in the Reich's final months. "Our duty is to hold until then." Lieutenant Hermann, who had discovered the depot, took a more pragmatic view. "Our duty is to our men first. We use the fuel to reach German lines, then reassess." Lieutenants Schrader and Dietrich, both younger and less ideologically committed, found themselves torn between their oath as officers and the undeniable logic of Reimann's assessment. As the debate continued, a runner approached from the depot perimeter. "Herr Oberst, scout reports Soviet reconnaissance units—" Approximately 5 kilometers east. Strength unknown. Ryman nodded. Thank you. Return to your post and maintain observation. He turned back to his officers. It seems our timeline has been compressed, gentlemen. We must act now. In that moment, with Soviet forces approaching and the weight of hundreds of lives in his hands, Colonel Friedrich Ryman made his decision. It was a choice that would haunt him for the remainder of his life, one that reflected the complex moral calculus faced by individuals caught in the machinery of catastrophic historical events. Captain Weber, you will take Lieutenant Schrader and half our remaining operational vehicles. Load them with wounded and essential personnel. Use only the fuel already in your tanks. Touch nothing from the depot. Your objective is to reach German lines west of the Oder. Lieutenant Hermann will provide you the reconnaissance reports of possible routes. Weber began to protest, but Raymond cut him off with a raised hand. This is a direct order, Captain. You will depart within the hour. The colonel turned to his remaining officers. Hermann, Dietrich, you and I will remain with the rest of our forces to secure this position and cover the withdrawal. The implications were clear. Ryman was splitting his command, sending half to relative safety while remaining behind with the rest in what would likely become a suicide mission. But the order regarding the fuel depot remained ambiguous, deliberately so, as Ryman well understood the impossible position he was placing his subordinates in. As Weber and Schrader departed to prepare their vehicles and personnel for immediate withdrawal, Ryman turned to Hermann and Dietrich. The three officers were now alone in the clearing. What I am about to say never happened, the colonel began quietly. This conversation does not exist. Do you understand? Both junior officers nodded, tension evident in their postures. The fuel in this depot cannot fall into Soviet hands, Ryman stated, nor can it be used to prolong a war that is already lost. When Weber is safely away, we will ensure both objectives are met. Hermann's eyes widened slightly, but he maintained his composure. How shall we proceed, Herr Oberst? We have demolition charges in the equipment transport. Not many, but enough for our purposes if placed correctly. The structure of the depot will do most of the work for us. Lieutenant Dietrich swallowed hard. Sir, this would be considered— It would be considered nothing, Dietrich, because it will never be reported, Ryman interrupted firmly. Officially, we discovered an abandoned fuel depot that had already been rigged with explosives by retreating German forces. During our inspection, the charges detonated. A tragic accident in the fog of war. The colonel's eyes hardened. The alternative is that this fuel extends the war by perhaps a few days, during which more German cities are bombed, more civilians die, and more of our soldiers fall in a cause that is already lost. That is the choice before us. The weight of the decision hung in the frigid air between them. Both junior officers understood that they were being asked to participate in an act that could be construed as sabotage, a capital offense under Nazi military law. Yet both also recognized the moral clarity in Ryman's assessment. I understand, Herr Oberst, Hermann finally said. Dietrich hesitated longer, but eventually nodded. As do I. Good, Ryman said, his voice returning to its normal professional tone. Then let us see to the withdrawal of Weber's group. Time is critical now. The next hour was a flurry of controlled activity. The regiment's remaining functional vehicles, 3 Panzer-Frühs, 2 SDKFZ, 2 51 half-tracks, and 4 assorted trucks, were prepared for departure. The wounded were loaded carefully into the more comfortable transports. Essential personnel were selected, primarily consisting of skilled mechanics, radio operators, and other specialists whose expertise would be valuable if they reached friendly lines. Captain Weber, still visibly unhappy with the orders but bound by military discipline, supervised the preparations with characteristic efficiency. He approached Ryman one final time before departure. Herr Oberst, I must formally protest this division of our forces. It violates tactical doctrine and places both groups at greater risk. Ryman regarded his subordinate steadily. Your protest is noted, Captain. Nevertheless, you have your orders. Get these men to safety. And the fuel, sir? Surely we should— The fuel depot will be properly secured, Captain. That is all you need to concern yourself with." Weber held his commander's gaze for a long moment, then saluted sharply. "It has been an honor serving under your command, Herr Oberst." Reimann returned the salute. "The honor has been mine, Weber. Now go and ensure that these men did not survive this long only to die in the final kilometers." As the small convoy of vehicles departed westward, following forest paths identified by Hermann's earlier reconnaissance, Reimann turned his attention to the approximately 300 men remaining under his command. They were a mix of infantry, tank crews without tanks, and support personnel, the remnants of what had once been an elite panzer regiment. The colonel gathered his remaining officers and non-commissioned officers for a briefing. He explained that they would establish a defensive perimeter around the fuel depot, ostensibly to secure it until reinforcements could arrive to transport the valuable supplies. Most of the men accepted this explanation without question. The possibility of reinforcements was remote, but the idea provided a framework of normalcy in the chaos of retreat. Only Hermann and Dietrich knew the actual plan, and both maintained the expected professional demeanor during the briefing. Afterward, as the defensive positions were being established, Reimann quietly ordered a small team of combat engineers to report to him at the depot entrance. "We need to assess the structural integrity of the facility," he told them, a plausible explanation given the age and condition of the installation. "Bring your full equipment kit." As dusk approached on January 17th, the situation around the depot grew increasingly tense. Soviet reconnaissance units had been spotted at the forest's edge, approximately 3 kilometers away. Radio intercepts suggested a larger force was moving in their direction, though whether the Soviets were specifically targeting the depot or simply advancing along a broad front remained unclear. Inside the underground facility, Reimann, Hermann, and the engineering team worked methodically by lantern light. The colonel had selected key structural points throughout the chamber, where small demolition charges would have maximum effect. The engineers, believing they were simply evaluating the facility, dutifully noted these locations. "The support columns show significant stress fractures," Reimann observed loudly, for the benefit of the engineers. "Note that particularly." When the assessment was complete, Reimann dismissed the engineers, but kept their equipment for further inspection. Once alone with Hermann and Dietrich, the real work began. "We have perhaps 2 hours before Soviet forces are upon us," the colonel stated, checking his watch. "The charges must be set, but not armed until the last possible moment. We will evacuate all personnel, except for a small rear guard, when the time comes." Dietrich looked troubled. "The men believe we are holding this position, sir. They're preparing defensive positions as we speak." "And they will hold those positions until I order a withdrawal," Reimann replied. "But I have no intention of sacrificing 300 lives for a symbolic last stand. When the time comes, we will fall back in an orderly fashion, leaving only enough men to trigger the charges and delay Soviet capture of the depot." The 3 officers worked quickly, placing small demolition charges at the critical points identified earlier. The steel fuel drums themselves would provide much of the destructive power once ignited. By 2100 hours, as darkness fully enveloped the forest, the preparations were complete. Reimann emerged from the depot to find Lieutenant Schmidt, his intelligence officer, waiting with a field radio. "Soviet forces are moving more quickly than anticipated, Herr Oberst," Schmidt reported tensely. "Forward observation posts report armored vehicles approximately 20 minutes from our position." Reimann nodded calmly. "Sound general withdrawal. All units to fall back to secondary positions as planned. Maintain defensive screen, but prepare for further westward movement on my command." As the orders spread through the German lines, the men began a disciplined withdrawal from their forward positions. Years of training and the harsh education of the Eastern Front had made such maneuvers second nature even in darkness. Vehicle engines remained silent to avoid detection. Movement was conducted on foot with minimal equipment. Reimann called together his final command group, Hermann, Dietrich, and 3 senior non-commissioned officers. "The situation has accelerated," he informed them. "Soviet armor will reach our position within minutes. We cannot hold against such force, nor is there strategic value in attempting to do so. He unfolded a map on the hood of a staff car, illuminating it briefly with a shielded flashlight. Our men will continue withdrawal to this position. He indicated a small village 7 kilometers west. From there, we will attempt to link up with any friendly forces still operating in the region. The NCOs accepted these orders without question and departed to supervise the withdrawal. When they were out of earshot, Raymond turned to his 2 confidants. "It must be now," he said simply. "The charges are set. We need only arm the detonators and establish a trigger mechanism." Hermann nodded grimly. "I'll see to it, Herr Oberst." "No," Raymond said firmly. "This responsibility is mine alone. You and Dietrich will accompany the main withdrawal. Ensure our men reach the fallback position." Both junior officers began to protest, but Raymond silenced them with a raised hand. "This is not open for discussion. The decision was mine. The consequences will be mine as well. You have your orders, gentlemen." As the last German troops melted into the darkness of the forest, moving westward in small, disciplined groups, Colonel Friedrich Reimann returned alone to the underground fuel depot. The sounds of approaching Soviet armor were now clearly audible. The distinctive rumble of T-34 engines, the metallic clatter of tracks on frozen ground. Inside the chamber that had so briefly seemed like salvation, Reimann worked methodically by the light of a single lantern. He armed each of the demolition charges, connecting them to a central detonator. The timing would be critical. Too soon, and the strategic impact would be minimal. Too late, and the fuel would fall into enemy hands. As he completed the final connections, Reimann paused. The weight of his actions pressed upon him with physical force. He was about to destroy resources that might have saved his men, might have gotten them safely home. Yet he was also potentially saving countless German lives by hastening, even marginally, the end of a war that was already lost. No training manual, no officers' academy, no military doctrine had prepared him for such a moment of moral complexity. In the sterile language of military regulations, what he was doing could be classified as sabotage or even treason. Yet, in the deeper ethical framework that transcended temporary political regimes, he believed he was fulfilling his true duty to his country and his men. Reimann completed the detonator assembly and set the timer for 30 minutes, enough time for him to put distance between himself and the depot, potentially enough time to rejoin his men at the fallback position. He took one final look around the underground chamber at the neatly arranged fuel drums that represented both military resource and moral quandary. Then he ascended the stairs to the surface. The night had grown colder, with a bitter wind whipping through the pine trees. The sounds of Soviet advance had grown louder. Occasional flares illuminated the eastern horizon, casting eerie green light across the snowbound landscape. Reimann oriented himself and began moving westward, following the tracks of his withdrawn troops. He had covered perhaps a kilometer when the distinctive sound of tank treads behind him caused him to freeze. Dropping instinctively to a prone position behind a fallen tree, he watched as a Soviet T-34-85 crashed through the underbrush less than 50 meters away, followed by infantry on foot. The tank's turret swiveled as its commander scanned the forest through vision ports. Reimann remained motionless, controlling his breathing despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The Soviet tank continued past his position, apparently following the main trail toward the depot. Additional infantry moved through the trees, speaking in low voices in Russian. When the immediate danger had passed, Reimann resumed his westward movement, now keeping to the densest parts of the forest, avoiding any open ground. He checked his watch by shielding it carefully, 15 minutes until detonation. He needed to put more distance between himself and what would soon become a massive conflagration. The colonel moved with the skill of a man who had survived 4 years of the most brutal theater in the war. Each footstep was placed deliberately to minimize sound. Each change in direction was calculated to utilize available cover. Despite his rank and age, Reimann remained a skilled frontline soldier. 10 minutes to detonation. He had covered perhaps another kilometer. The sounds of Soviet forces had faded somewhat behind him, though occasional bursts of submachine gun fire suggested they were securing the area around the depot. Ryman allowed himself a moment of hope that he might actually escape, might rejoin his men, and lead them further westward. That hope was shattered by the sound of voices ahead, Russian voices. Ryman dropped again, this time behind a small ridge. Peering carefully over the snow-covered ground, he saw the silhouettes of Soviet infantry moving toward him, a flanking force, or perhaps simply a broader sweep of the forest. He was caught between two enemy groups, with minimal cover and only his service pistol for defense. Firing would immediately give away his position and ensure his death. Remaining hidden was increasingly impossible as the Soviet troops methodically moved through the area. 5 minutes to detonation. Colonel Friedrich Ryman made his final decision of the war. Rather than attempt to evade or engage the Soviet troops, he removed his officer's cap, set aside his pistol, and slowly stood with his hands raised. The nearest Soviet soldiers immediately spotted him, swinging their PPSH-41 submachine guns in his direction and shouting commands in Russian. Ryman kept his hands visible and spoke in clear German. Ich ergebe mich, Offizier. I surrender, officer. The Soviet troops approached cautiously, weapons trained on him. One of them, apparently understanding some German, stepped forward. Name, unit, he demanded in broken German. Oberst Friedrich Ryman, 25th Panzer Regiment, Ryman replied calmly. The information caused visible interest among the Soviet soldiers. An officer was a valuable intelligence prize, particularly one of Ryman's rank. One soldier quickly searched him for weapons, while others maintained their covering fire. His pistol was discovered and confiscated, along with his watch, compass, and the Iron Cross at his throat. The Soviet NCO in charge made a quick decision. You come, now. He gestured with his weapon toward the east, back in the direction of the fuel depot. 2 minutes to detonation. Ryman had no choice but to comply. Surrounded by enemy troops, he was marched eastward through the forest. The Soviet soldiers moved quickly, obviously eager to deliver their prize to their commanding officers. Ryman maintained a dignified bearing despite the rough treatment, walking steadily through the snow with his hands still raised. They had covered perhaps 500 meters when the night erupted behind them. The demolition charges had detonated, igniting the massive fuel stockpile in a catastrophic chain reaction. The shock wave knocked several of the soldiers off their feet. The forest was suddenly illuminated as if by midday sun, shadows dancing crazily among the pine trees. The Soviet troops instinctively dropped to defensive positions, momentarily forgetting their prisoner as they assessed the new threat. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air from the direction of the depot, accompanied by secondary explosions as individual fuel drums were launched skyward by the initial blast. In the chaos and confusion, with his captors temporarily distracted, Colonel Ryman might have attempted escape. Instead, he stood transfixed by the distant inferno, watching as 50,000 gallons of fuel that might have prolonged the war by days or weeks, erupted into the night sky. One of the Soviet soldiers noticed Ryman's expression and roughly grabbed his arm, shouting questions in Russian that the German officer couldn't understand. When Ryman didn't respond, the soldier struck him with a rifle butt, knocking him to his knees in the snow. As he was roughly hauled back to his feet, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, Colonel Friedrich Ryman caught one final glimpse of the massive fireball illuminating the horizon. In that moment, despite his capture and the certain hardship of Soviet imprisonment ahead, a subtle expression crossed his face, not quite satisfaction, but perhaps the grim recognition that he had fulfilled what he saw as his final duty. The Soviet soldiers, now even more agitated by the explosion, hurried their prisoner eastward. As they marched him through the winter forest toward an uncertain fate, the night sky continued to glow orange with the funeral pyre of Germany's lost war. For Colonel Friedrich Ryman, Wehrmacht officer and reluctant saboteur, the war had ended. but the moral complexity of his actions, the destruction of resources that might have saved his men in the short term but prolonged a catastrophic conflict, would echo through history as an example of the impossible choices faced by individuals caught in the machinery of wars they neither started nor could stop. The inferno raged through the night, visible for kilometers in every direction. Soviet forces, initially believing they were under attack, eventually realized they had captured a significant German fuel depot, only to lose it in the same moment. Intelligence officers would spend days trying to determine whether the destruction had been a planned German demolition or an accident in the confusion of retreat. Only 3 men knew the truth: Colonel Ryman, Lieutenant Hermann, and Lieutenant Dietrich. And as dawn broke on January 18, 1945, their fates had dramatically diverged. Ryman was in Soviet custody, being transported eastward for interrogation. Hermann and Dietrich were leading the remnants of the regiment westward, still hoping to reach German lines at the Oder River. The story of what happened to the 3 officers over the coming weeks, months, and years forms an extraordinary epilogue to the fuel depot incident, one that illuminates the chaotic final collapse of the Third Reich and the complex moral reckonings that followed. Colonel Friedrich Reimann's journey into Soviet captivity began with 3 days of continuous interrogation. Initially held at a forward command post near Łódź, he was questioned relentlessly about German force deployments, defensive plans, and the state of morale among Wehrmacht troops. Despite physical exhaustion and occasional rough treatment, Reimann maintained the dignified bearing expected of a senior officer. He provided his name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention, but little else of tactical value. What particularly frustrated his Soviet interrogators was Reimann's refusal to explain the destruction of the fuel depot. When asked directly about the explosion, he would only state that the facility had been rigged with demolition charges when his unit discovered it, a pre-planned destruction by retreating German forces that had accidentally detonated during his inspection. The colonel was unusual, noted NKVD Captain Leonid Baranov in his official report. Unlike many captured German officers who attempt to curry favor through cooperation, this one maintained a strange composure. He seemed almost at peace despite his circumstances, as if some greater burden had been lifted from him. After preliminary questioning, Reimann was transferred eastward to a larger prisoner processing facility near Minsk. There, he joined thousands of other German prisoners, most of them enlisted men with a scattering of junior officers. The conditions were harsh: overcrowded barracks, minimal food, inadequate medical care, but not yet the brutal labor camps that many would eventually experience in the Soviet interior. Meanwhile, the remnants of Reimann's regiment, now under the de facto command of Lieutenant Hermann, continued their desperate westward movement. Captain Weber's group, which had departed earlier, had successfully reached German lines at the Oder River, bringing with them the wounded and specialist personnel as ordered. When questioned about Colonel Reimann and the rest of the regiment, Weber could only report that they had remained behind to secure an important supply depot. Hermann's group, numbering approximately 280 men, after several small skirmishes with Soviet advance units, moved primarily at night through increasingly difficult terrain. The winter of 1945 had been particularly severe, with temperatures regularly dropping to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Pneumonia claimed lives. Yet the disciplined corps of veteran soldiers maintained cohesion and purpose. Lieutenant Dietrich kept a small diary during this period, writing by candlelight in cramped farm outbuildings where the group occasionally found shelter. His entries provide a remarkable window into the psychological state of German soldiers in the war's final months. January 21, 1945. We continue westward. Food supplies critically low. The men do not complain, though their faces grow more hollow each day. We avoid main roads entirely. Soviet aircraft constantly overhead. No sign of Luftwaffe. The colonel's absence is felt keenly. Hermann leads competently, but lacks the same quiet authority. The men sense something happened at the depot, though none speak of it directly. January 23, 1945. Pass through abandoned village today. Houses empty, livestock gone. Strange to see German territory so deserted. Found civilian casualties in one home. Family of 4. Appeared to be suicides. The father's service photo from the Great War still on the wall. Herman ordered burial despite time pressure. "We remain human," he said, "even now." January 25, 1945. Encountered Wehrmacht stragglers, approximately 30 men from various units. No officers. They tell of chaos behind us. Berlin reportedly in panic. Goebbels calls for total resistance. Hitler has not been seen in public for weeks. The men whisper that he is dead or insane. Herman invited the stragglers to join us. Most did. Others continued alone, speaking of families further west. January 28, 1945, reached outskirts of Frankfurt an der Oder. German defensive positions visible on West Bank. Soviet artillery active. Crossing will be hazardous. Herman called officers' meeting tonight. First time he spoke openly about the depot incident. "The colonel made the right choice," he said. "The war is lost. Our duty now is to save as many of our men as possible." Dietrich agreed. Schmidt questioned whether we had abandoned our oath. No resolution to this debate. Each man must answer to his own conscience. On January 30, 1945, 12 years to the day since Hitler had been appointed Chancellor of Germany, Herman's group made their crossing of the Oder River. It was a harrowing operation conducted in pre-dawn darkness, utilizing small boats and makeshift rafts. Soviet artillery fired intermittently, illumination flares casting ghostly light across the frozen landscape. Several men were lost to the frigid waters. Others fell to Soviet fire. But the majority reached the western bank, where they were integrated into the hastily assembled defensive positions of Army Group Vistula. For most of the regiment's survivors, the war would continue for another 3 months, a grinding retreat across Germany, punctuated by increasingly desperate battles against overwhelming Soviet forces. Of the approximately 600 men who had been with Colonel Ryman at the fuel depot in mid-January, fewer than 200 would survive to see Germany's final surrender in May. Captain Weber, who had led the first group to safety as ordered by Ryman, would die during the Battle of Berlin, killed by Soviet artillery while defending a position near the Reichstag on April 29, 1945, one day before Hitler's suicide. He never learned the truth about what had happened at the fuel depot. Lieutenant Herman survived the war, surrendering to American forces near Magdeburg in April 1945. As a junior officer without known connections to war crimes or Nazi Party organizations, he was processed through denazification procedures and released from custody in early 1946. He returned to his hometown near Dresden, only to find it now part of the Soviet occupation zone. Unwilling to live under communist rule, he fled westward again, eventually settling in Stuttgart. Lieutenant Dietrich's fate followed a different path. Captured by Soviet forces during a failed counterattack in February 1945, he was initially processed as a regular prisoner of war. However, his diary, containing the controversial entries about the fuel depot and Colonel Ryman's decisions, was discovered during routine searches. The implications of potential sabotage by a German officer caught the attention of NKVD officials, who separated Dietrich for specialized interrogation. Under intense pressure and likely torture, Dietrich eventually revealed the truth about the depot's destruction. This information set in motion a series of investigations that would have far-reaching consequences for Colonel Hyman. Ryman himself had been transferred from the processing center near Minsk to a permanent POW camp in the Ural Mountains by February 1945. The facility, known as Camp 241, housed approximately 3,000 German prisoners, primarily officers. Conditions were severe: 12-hour workdays in nearby timber operations, inadequate rations, minimal medical care, and temperatures that regularly dropped to 30 degrees below zero. Despite these hardships, Ryman adapted with the same stoic resilience he had shown throughout his military career. Fellow prisoners later recalled his quiet leadership within the camp, organizing fair distribution of scarce resources, mediating disputes, maintaining military discipline where possible, and preserving a sense of dignity among men who had lost everything. He never spoke of victory or of Hitler, remembered Major Heinrich Bauer, another prisoner at Camp 241, but neither did he speak of defeat or surrender. He focused only on survival, not just physical survival, but maintaining our humanity under inhuman conditions. This relative stability was shattered in April 1945 when NKVD officers arrived at Camp 241 specifically to reinterrogate Ryman about the fuel depot incident. Armed with Dietrich's confession, they confronted the colonel with detailed knowledge of what had actually occurred on January 17th. According to witnesses, Ryman listened impassively to the accusations, then responded with a single sentence: "I acted as I believed necessary for the greater good of Germany." He was immediately removed from the general prisoner population and transferred to Moscow's Lubyanka prison, where he faced a new round of intensive interrogation. The Soviet authorities were less concerned with the destruction of the fuel, a minor loss in the context of the massive Eastern Front, than with understanding the psychology and motivation of a German officer who had effectively committed sabotage against his own forces. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. For millions of German prisoners in Soviet hands, this event marked not liberation, but the beginning of an indefinite captivity. Many would remain in Soviet labor camps for a decade or more. Some would never return. For Colonel Friedrich Ryman, the end of the war brought a peculiar twist of fate. The Soviet authorities, having thoroughly investigated the fuel depot incident, came to view him not as a war criminal, but as an anomaly worthy of study. A German officer who had recognized the futility of continued resistance and acted to hasten the war's end. In late 1945, Ryman was transferred to a specialized facility outside Moscow where Soviet psychologists and intelligence officers conducted extended interviews about his experiences, motivations, and worldview. The transcripts of these sessions, partially declassified in 1992, provide extraordinary insight into Ryman's thinking during those crucial days in January 1945. "I did not destroy the fuel to aid the Soviet advance," he stated in one interview. "I did it because every day the war continued meant more German deaths, more destruction of what remained of my country. The Reich was already lost. The only question was, how many more would die before the inevitable end?" When asked about his oath to Hitler and the Nazi regime, Ryman's response reflected the moral complexity faced by many German officers. "My first oath was to Germany, taken when I joined the Reichswehr before Hitler came to power. In my mind, that oath superseded all others." By January 1945, Hitler's continued prosecution of a hopeless war had become Germany's greatest enemy. "My loyalty to my country required me to act as I did." Remarkably, the Soviet authorities eventually classified Ryman as a progressive element rather than a war criminal. While this did not result in immediate release, it spared him the harsher treatments inflicted on many German officers in Soviet captivity. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hermann had begun rebuilding his life in West Germany. Working initially as a manual laborer, the only employment available to many former Wehrmacht officers, he eventually secured a position as a logistics manager for a manufacturing firm in Stuttgart. He married in 1947 and started a family, telling his wife nothing of his wartime experiences beyond the most general outlines. In 1950, during the early years of the Cold War, Hermann was contacted by agents of the newly formed Gehlen organization, the intelligence agency that would eventually become West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, BND. They were particularly interested in his knowledge of Soviet military operations and prisoner processing procedures, gleaned during his time on the Eastern Front and from his contacts with returned POWs. Hermann agreed to provide what information he could, partly out of anti-communist conviction and partly out of financial necessity. During one debriefing session, he mentioned Colonel Ryman and the fuel depot incident, the first time he had spoken of it to anyone since the war's end. This information eventually reached American intelligence channels. The U.S. authorities, engaged in building networks of informants and potential resistance assets behind the Iron Curtain, became interested in Ryman as a possible recruit, a German officer with no strong Nazi ties who had already demonstrated willingness to act against totalitarian authority. Through diplomatic back channels established during the immediate post-war period, American officials made inquiries about Ryman's status. To their surprise, they received a response. Colonel Ryman was alive and in Soviet custody at a specialized facility rather than a standard labor camp. What followed was an extraordinary Cold War exchange. In October 1952, Colonel Friedrich Ryman was released from Soviet custody and allowed to cross into West Berlin at Checkpoint Charlie, one of the earliest East-West prisoner exchanges of the Cold War period. In return, the Americans released 2 Soviet agents who had been captured in West Germany. Ryman emerged from 7 years of captivity, a physically diminished but mentally intact man of 50. American intelligence officers debriefed him extensively, particularly interested in his knowledge of Soviet interrogation techniques and prisoner camp conditions. However, they found him reluctant to engage in any potential intelligence operations against the Soviets. "I have seen enough of war and conflict," he reportedly told his American handlers. "My only wish now is to live quietly in what remains of my homeland." Released from American custody in early 1953, Ryman settled in Munich, where he lived in modest circumstances on a small military pension. He avoided publicity and declined multiple offers to write memoirs or give interviews about his wartime experiences. His neighbors knew him only as a quiet, dignified man who kept largely to himself. In 1956, a chance encounter changed the trajectory of Ryman's post-war life. While shopping at a local market, he came face-to-face with Lieutenant Hermann, who had moved to Munich for a new position with an automotive company. The two men, bound by the secret of that January night in 1945, initially regarded each other with shock, then wordless recognition. They met later that week at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. For hours, they spoke of what had happened at the fuel depot, of their divergent paths since, and of the moral weight both still carried from their decisions. "I have never regretted what we did," Hermann told his former commander, "but neither have I found peace with it." Ryman nodded. "There is no peace to be found in such choices, Klaus. Only the knowledge that we acted according to our best understanding in an impossible situation." This reconnection proved profoundly important for both men. Over the following years, they met regularly, providing each other the unique understanding that only those who had shared such experiences could offer. Hermann eventually introduced Ryman to his family, presenting him simply as "my former commanding officer," without elaboration. In 1958, they received news that completed their wartime circle. Lieutenant Dietrich had survived Soviet captivity and had been repatriated to East Germany. Unlike many returning prisoners, he had chosen to remain in the German Democratic Republic, working as an engineering instructor at a technical college in Leipzig. Through carefully worded letters passed through neutral channels, the 3 officers re-established contact, though they would not meet in person again until after German reunification decades later. The fuel depot incident remained largely unknown to the wider public until 1978, when a historical researcher investigating the Soviet advance through Poland discovered references to the destroyed depot in Red Army archives. The researcher, Dr. Anton Hoffmann of Cologne University, became intrigued by the contradictory reports surrounding the explosion and the unusual treatment of Colonel Ryman by Soviet authorities. Hoffmann eventually traced Ryman to Munich and requested an interview. To his surprise, the aging colonel agreed, his first and only public discussion of the events of January 1945. The resulting academic paper, published in the Journal of Modern European Military History, presented the fuel depot incident as a case study in the moral complexities faced by officers in the war's final stages. Without sensationalism or political agenda, Hoffman documented the impossible choice Reimann had confronted: use the fuel to facilitate his regiment's immediate survival while prolonging a lost war, or destroy it to hasten an inevitable defeat and potentially save more lives in the long term. The paper received little attention outside academic circles. Germany in the late 1970s was still navigating the complex processes of confronting its Nazi past, and the narrative of a Wehrmacht officer making such a morally nuanced choice did not fit neatly into either the denunciation or rehabilitation narratives that dominated public discourse. Colonel Friedrich Reimann died in Munich on March 17, 1983, at the age of 81. His funeral was attended by a small group of family members. He had married a widow in 1965, and a few former military colleagues, including Lieutenant Herrmann, by then retired. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned only his rank and years of service, with no reference to the fuel depot incident or his unique place in the war's final chapter. Lieutenant Klaus Herrmann lived until 1997, long enough to see the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. In his final years, he wrote a private memoir for his children and grandchildren, finally documenting in detail the events of January 1945 and their profound impact on his life. The memoir, published privately for family members, contained his final reflection on Colonel Reimann and their shared decision. What the colonel did, what we did, was neither heroic nor treasonous. It was simply human. Caught between impossible choices, we acted according to our best understanding of duty to our men and to our country, not to a regime or an ideology. History may judge us, but we found a kind of peace in knowing that in those final terrible days we remembered our humanity when so many others had forgotten theirs. Lieutenant Dietrich, the youngest of the three officers, lived the longest. After German reunification, he moved to Dresden, where he died in 2005 at the age of 83. His personal papers, donated to the German Military History Museum, included the original diary he had kept during the retreat from Poland, its pages still bearing the marks of Soviet handling during his interrogation. The diary now forms part of the museum's permanent exhibition on the ethical dimensions of military service. The site of the fuel depot itself remained unmarked and largely forgotten in the dense Polish forest. Occasional reports from hikers or forestry workers described a strange, concrete structure buried beneath decades of vegetation, but no official investigation was conducted until 2010, when a Polish-German historical commission began documenting forgotten World War II sites along the former Eastern Front. Their excavation revealed the charred and collapsed remains of the underground facility. Soil samples still showed traces of petroleum compounds more than 6 decades after the explosion. Metal fragments of fuel drums, their Nazi markings still visible despite corrosion, were recovered and placed in the Warsaw Military Museum. Today, a small interpretive marker stands at the site, with text in both Polish and German. It describes the underground depot's construction and destruction in neutral historical terms, mentioning Colonel Reimann's role, but offering no judgment on his actions. Local guides occasionally bring small groups of military history enthusiasts to the site, relating the story of the 50,000 gallons of fuel that might have extended the war, and the German colonel who chose to destroy it rather than use it. In military academies across Europe and America, the Reimann case is now studied as an example of the ethical complexities that can confront officers when strategic reality diverges from political rhetoric. The fuel depot incident raises profound questions about the nature of duty, the limits of obedience, and the moral agency of individuals caught in the machinery of war. For military ethicists, Reimann's decision represents a rare documented case of an officer making a conscious choice to hasten his own side's defeat, not out of treason or cowardice, but out of a complex calculation regarding the ultimate good of his country and the lives of his countrymen. It challenges simple narratives of loyalty and betrayal, suggesting that genuine patriotism may sometimes require actions that appear, superficially, to be their opposite. For historians of the war's final phase, the incident illuminates the psychological state of the German officer corps in early 1945, when many recognized the inevitability of defeat while remaining bound by oaths, training, and the practical reality that surrender often meant death or indefinite captivity. And for those who study the human dimension of warfare, the story of Colonel Ryman, Lieutenant Hermann, and Lieutenant Dietrich demonstrates how individuals can maintain moral agency even within the most catastrophic of historical circumstances, making choices whose consequences they may never fully know, yet which reflect their best understanding of duty and humanity, in moments when both seem impossible to reconcile. The 50,000 gallons of fuel that burned in the Polish forest on that January night in 1945 represented more than just military resources. They embodied the moral weight of choices made by individuals caught in the collapse of a regime that had long since abandoned any claim to ethical legitimacy. In choosing to destroy rather than use those resources, Colonel Friedrich Ryman neither shortened nor lengthened the war in any measurable way. But he maintained his own moral compass in a time when such compasses had never been more necessary nor more difficult to follow. The horror he experienced was not just witnessing Germany's inevitable defeat, it was recognizing his own complicity in a system that had brought such catastrophe upon his country, and finding within himself the courage to make one small choice that might, in some way he could not measure, reduce the final tally of suffering. 75 years after that night in the Polish forest, the site of the fuel depot has been reclaimed by nature. Pine trees grow where soldiers once stood. Wildlife moves freely across land once divided by front lines and ideologies. Yet beneath the forest floor, traces of that moment remain in corroded metal, in petroleum-laced soil, and in the complex legacy of choices made when the world was on fire.